Welcome to the 5th session of the first day at Charbagh Z Jaipur Literature Festival. Before we begin, I would request you to keep the aisle free for your own safety and security, and also to put your phones on silent mode. If you must take a call, please do so outside the venue. We are delighted to introduce our next session, The Tears of the Rajas, sponsored by Getty Foundation. Please welcome Ferdinand Mound in conversation with Swapan Dasgupta and William Dalrymple.
Okay.
So, go for it.
Hello, good afternoon. About 6 months ago, I was presented a book of about 800 pages, or what seemed like 800 pages, not a very portable book, and said, can you produce a review in 4 days' time? I declined because I believe that a book should be read before it is reviewed. But I think that was really one of my worst decisions, because when I was told that I would have to be a moderator for a session in conversation with Ferdinand Mount and read the book, I actually read the book in 4 days. And that's actually a tribute to this book. Firstly, I never expected that the same Ferdinand Mount, whose book on the British Constitution had been referred to me quite approvingly, was a person who also dabbled in Indian history. But it's Indian history of a very different variety. It's really, you can read it at different levels. You can read it as a family history. You can read it as a history of the earlier or the middling periods of the East India Company, or you can read it as a history of rather peripatetic Scots, two of whom are present here. The second one purely for point of inspiration. Now, this is a book which is not meant to be fashionable, because the subject of this book is bound to raise hackles of a lot of people, especially those who believe in the notion of post-colonial angst. How some of these dead white males reappear.
Not a condition, Swapan, you've ever suffered from.
Not a condition I've suffered from, really, as you well know. But of course, such criticism will be there. But what fascinates me about it is that Ferdinand Mount, whose connections to India have hitherto been tangential, actually decided to probe the history of his family, the Lowes, the Thackeray's, the Shakespeare's, and produce this. Now, how he came to write this book and what it's really about is something which I think he should explain to begin with, because that's a story in itself. So, Ferdinand.
Thank you very much, Swapan, and thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to be in this stupendous gathering here. When my great-great-grandfather came to Jaipur to be the British resident a couple of centuries ago, he had the Raj Mahal palace to himself, and he wrote back to his mother in Scotland. He said, there's not a European soul within 90 miles of here, except for one Scottish surgeon. Well, it's all rather changed now. I actually went to the Raj Mahal this morning, and it's as magnificent as ever. It was completely empty, and there, sitting on the lawn, was one solitary, majestic figure, Mr. Stephen Fry, and I thought, he is the new British resident. So it was very nice to see him. And it's particularly nice to have Willie here on the platform, because I owe him so much. I've been stumbling in his footsteps these past 5 years, and he may not remember, but he gave the most dramatic start to my researches, because my very first afternoon in India, he very kindly gave us a guided tour of the Mehrauli Archaeological Park, just outside Delhi by the Qutb Minar. And he stood on this wonderful Mughal tomb, which had been converted into a British country house for the resident of the day, and has now been reconverted, or rather stripped back to be a Mughal tomb again. And he stood on the platform above us and read in that resonant voice you all know so well, you could hear it from the top of the Qutb Minar, I should think, a chapter about the eccentric resident of that time, Metcalfe. And I realized, not at that minute, but later, that what he was reading about was a part of my family, this huge extended clan in India for the 100 years of the 19th century. And in fact, my great-aunt Charlotte had conceived her first child on the very spot where Willie was standing.
Very fecund spot.
Fecund spot. And unfortunately, she married this tearaway brute called Theo Metcalfe, and they went up to Shimla for her to give birth, and she died in childbirth. And he was distraught, and he went berserk, and then during the 1857, or the aftermath of 1857, he behaved with extreme ferocity, so much so that he had to be sent home. Anyway,
The only member of the Indian civil service who actually got sacked from 1857.
yeah. So great Uncle Theo has a lot to answer for. But I never thought otherwise that I'd be writing a history like this at all. The British in India, very much, both in Britain and in India today, although it was an extraordinarily long period of history and one of great importance and great bloodshed and great injustice, but also great development, has retreated into relative obscurity. I knew that my grandmother's family had devoted their lives to the East India Company, and I knew too that my great-aunt Ursula Lowe, had written a book about them all. It was called 50 Years with John Company, and it sounded like a real grind because, and we all had a copy on our shelves at home, but none of us had read it because Aunt Ursula was the classic maiden aunt. She was like Miss Marple, only without the sense of humour. So, anything by her was likely to be very stuffy and uninteresting. But then several things happened. The most important thing that happened was that my daughter Mary married the brilliant Indian writer Pankaj Mishra and produced my darling granddaughter Maya, and we came to India with them under their wing. And just as we were leaving London, and this was the real trigger, I opened the Sunday Times and read the headline, "By Jingo, PM's family killed for the empire." And a really lurid story. And underneath it said, "Rediscovered letters reveal with bloody relish how David Cameron's ancestors helped put down the Indian Mutiny." Cameron had the week before made a goodwill visit to India, his first as Prime Minister, and hope of forging new trade links, as new Prime Ministers always hope. But the Sunday Times said he did not mention his own family's part in that history. It's now emerged that his great-great-grandfather was a British cavalryman, infantryman actually, but they always get these things wrong, who mercilessly helped suppress the Indian Mutiny, left behind accounts of how he slew natives with his sabre and almost lost a hand and an ear. He also participated in a mass hanging of civilians that would be accounted as a war crime by modern standards. And these were all attributed to John Lowe and his sons, Malcolm and Robert. Now, these were all my great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather, and they happen to be Cameron's ancestors too, because we have a mutual link. And I found this report very startling and disorienting, and at my time of life, you're not often startled because you think you know it all. But this was really a surprise to me, because I hadn't thought of my granny's family as mass murderers. In fact, I thought they were rather dull. And my father did remember his grandfather Malcolm, one of the supposed slashers and murderers. He was a sweet old gentleman who was rather frightened of his wife, who was rather better born than he was. Anyway, I wondered where this news story had come from. And anyway, the story said that it came from the distinguished medieval historian Nick Barrett, who's an expert on Magna Carta, but being an expert on Magna Carta doesn't pay the bills, so he moonlights as the genealogist on the TV program Who Do You Think You Are? So he's a great genealogist. Where had he found this stuff? Well, it said he'd found it from letters uncovered last week in a book in the British Library. Well, a book in the British Library, well, you know, all books are in the British Library. So really it was just sitting there waiting to be discovered, or read rather than discovered. Anyway, I wondered what this book was. It couldn't be, and I went to my shelves and took down 50 Years with John Company, where it had been sitting unread for at least 40 years, and thumbed through the index, and I discovered that every single fact in the whole Sunday Times story was taken from Aunt Ursy's book. And she was the sole source for this whole thing. And I thought it was rather wonderful, this woman who'd been really disregarded for most of her life and rather unloved, should suddenly hit the headlines, because it made quite a splash in India too. So then that's how it started. That's how I then and there resolved to read every line of her forgotten work and make up for the years of neglect and immerse myself in this part of my history. I wanted, if you like, to know who I was. So that's how I came to get going on this. It was a very strange story, very surprising, because General Lowe, Sir John Lowe, took an active part in deposing 3 Rajas, each of them rulers over a territory and population the size of Portugal. He deprived a 4th Raja, the Nizam of Hyderabad, of perhaps the largest and most fertile part of his kingdom. He survived 3 shattering mutinies, yet at no time do you feel that he was spurred on by any sense of imperial mission. He wanted to do his duty, but that was all. And this is the great paradox, and I'll shut up after this. He was known all over India for his passionate belief in native rule. Disraeli paid tribute to General Lowe for his great support for native rule and native government in India. His vision of the British Empire was the old-fashioned one of what was called non-interference, what modern scholars like Ranajit Guha call domination without hegemony. The British were to exercise a benign overlordship at arm's length. They would protect native states, they'd protect the trade, which was the reason they'd come to in the first place, but they wouldn't turf out the native rulers, nor would they interfere with native customs and faith. Yet steadily, state by state, the British assumed direct rule and sent the weeping Rajas into exile. And they did so, alas, very often not for the high-minded motives they proclaimed, but to gain control over state revenues and over the valuable crops and natural resources in which South Asia is so rich. In fact, writing this book was a course in South Asian geography and mineralogy. The tin mines of Banka, the opium fields of Malwa, the cotton fields of Hyderabad, one by one they were all taken over. And John Lowe started very early. He was only a lieutenant when he escorted the Peshwa at the end of the Maratha Wars all the way into exile, into what was then called Hindustan. And the Peshwa was weeping most of the way as he went through his vast kingdoms with this young lieutenant trotting along by his side. And then he literally turfed the boy king of Lucknow off his throne in the middle of the night because he thought he was unreliable tool of the Begum, and installed a separate one. And then finally he gave his approval, he gave the approval to Lord Dalhousie for the takeover of the whole kingdom of Awadh, which it was one of the prime causes of the great uprising of 1857. So he was always there. The only people who stood out against him were the Ranis. They were always tougher. The females were much tougher than the males because they'd had a harder row to fight to maintain their position. So one by one, they were the ones who stood out, and most famously, of course, when Lowe and Dalhousie annexed Jhansi, the Rani Lakshmi Bai, the great Indian heroine, said she wasn't going to have any of that. It's an extraordinary recurring theme, that the female of the species being more deadly than the male. Perhaps that's what...
Begum Hazrat Mahal in Lucknow later.
And Hazrat Mahal in like... So again and again it happened. So I've created... it isn't a series of biographies. One time I called it a human jungle book. But it's also a story about the spread of British power in this strange, jerky, half wanting it, half not wanting it fashion, which spread over half a century and ultimately provoked the greatest rebellion in the history of the British Empire, and what I think was the most traumatic event for the British nation in the whole of the 19th century. And every back street in every city in England bears memories of the scars of Cawnpore and Lucknow and the rest of it. So it's been a surprise trip, and I'm delighted that it should end up here in Jaipur with you all.
Tell me, Willie, being another Scot, and I think it's important to realize that the British Empire in India was more appropriately a Scottish Empire in India, a fact of life which is sometimes expediently overlooked. Tell me, in approaching the history of both the company and the crown later, through the lens of a family, and I think you also have a lot of family connections with India.
Some of the same ones, Shakespeare's.
The Shakespeare's, yes, we are.
Okay, so it's a very...
incestuous, imperial thing.
So all the 10 Scots will sort of hopefully write one day. How rewarding is it, and what do you think are its inherent limitations?
So first of all, talk about the Scots. In the East India Company, I think an astonishing, something like 65% of East India Company writers were Scots, when we were only, whatever it is, 10% of the population. And the reason for that is that you had to be sufficiently well connected and well educated to get through the door of the company. You had to know somebody, had to know a director. It was all done by patronage. Competitive exams came in much, much later.
Yeah, we were wondering where we got that from.
But you also had to be sufficiently desperate to want to do it, because most people didn't come back again. The mortality rates, I mean, most Europeans lasted about 6 months in Calcutta in the 18th century, and mortality rates got better later on. But so you had to be posh, well connected, and desperate, and that tended to be the fate of most Scots, particularly after 1745, the Jacobite Rebellion, when we were effectively conquered by the English, and particularly in the Highlands, garrisons which look very like the garrison. So there's a Fort George in Inverness, which is very like Fort George in Madras. There's a Fort William on the west coast of Scotland, which is the mirror of Fort William in Calcutta. So the Scots, I think, were themselves occupied and then went out and took advantage of this. And to a certain extent, you could say we still occupy, not only, we still occupy England, in that the last 4 prime ministers have all got Scottish names. The current head of the Foreign Office, Simon Fraser, is a Scot. The head of the Army, Duffy. The head of the Navy. It goes on, McTaggart. And these guys, we have one after another of occupying the English. And we have to do this because our country is very poor. And it's very cold and it's foggy and rather miserable. And so England was always one choice, but India was a more alluring one.
Yeah, which is perhaps explains why the absence of India makes you want to have a separate country.
Well, exactly. To answer the second question about family history, it's a very difficult thing to pull off, and I have lots of ancestors who have been here, and occasionally they weave their way in and out of the books. But you have to be very lucky to be like Ferdy's lot, who are in all the most interesting places at the right time. Most family histories are boring because most families don't merit a book in themselves. Very few families are sufficiently interesting to actually make a really good story. And what's extraordinary with your lot is they were everywhere. Every major event in this period has at least one, possibly two, and often three of your ancestors going around doing wicked things.
Exactly.
And it's a terrific book, and I have to say, it gives me hope that one day I might be able to do it. But it's, yours were more coherent and more concentrated. It's a very, very good story, Ferdy has to tell.
I think, I'm really English, though. When I go to Scotland, I go to County Fife, or the Kingdom of Fife, as it's called, where this particular lot all came from. It's actually full of smiling fields. It's not the most desperate place in the world. Cold, certainly. There's a terrible chill off the North Sea. But I still find it strange, knowing what they knew about the prospects of coming back. As Willie says, 5 out of 6 of them in the early days didn't live to draw their pension.
It was called the Great Indian Lottery.
Yes.
My wife's ancestors, the Frasers, there were literally 6 brothers who went out, 1 came back.
Extraordinary. So when people complained that the seaside resorts of Bournemouth and so on were all filled with retired Indians, think how much fuller it would have been if they'd all lived. I mean, and then you think how strange it was is when you go to any country where there's been large-scale emigration, that all around you, between St Andrews and Kirkcaldy, every single young man at the age of 15, 16, 17 was going off to India. And so, of course, the girls had to follow them if they wanted to find husbands, hence the appearance of the famous fishing fleets. But it must have been a very strange experience.
What's extraordinary is how also across classes.
Yes.
And a lot of Hindi ended up in Scots vernacular. My Scottish nanny who left school at 15 and had never been to India or knew anything of India. I remember when I was ill, she used to say I was Piliwali. And Piliwali, of course, is Pilawala. It's like jaundice. And there's lots of this. There were so many Scots out here, and so many that came back with Indian things and Indian blood in most of our cases too at this period. Everyone intermarried.
One of the associated features of this, which is slightly intriguing but yet quite fascinating, is the extent to which, from your book, it comes out. Embarking on the Indian project was also financially a hit and miss. I mean, that actually disputes the thing that here were people who were basically bounty hunters. I mean, certainly there were people who got pretty lucrative returns at the end of it. But for a lot of people, being in India meant a life's indebtedness.
It certainly did, and a large part of the characters in my book, were bankrupt most of the time, my great-grandfather couldn't bear to go via Bombay when he was travelling around India because he might bump into Mount Stuart Elphinstone, the governor there, because he borrowed I borrowed a lakh from him 3 years before, and he had no hope of paying it back, and that debt hung over him to his life's end. And then he went back. He thought he'd retired to Scotland, went back to St Andrews, and discovered he was broke in Scotland too. And so he came out again at the age of 60, without a job, and he came into Calcutta, as he said himself, as an umidwar, a man hanging around looking for a job, of which there are a lot of officers like that. And he did a kind of fatal bargain with Lord Dalhousie, a fellow Scot from just across the Forth. Dalhousie said, "You can go and be resident in Hyderabad as long as you bring me back a treaty." And the treaty that he was charged to bring back was the infamous one which gave the British government the fat lands of Berar, and gave them in a little clause that they sneaked into the treaty afterwards. He didn't even tell the Nizam about it, in perpetuity. And certainly the row went on in perpetuity because the resentment felt in Hyderabad lasted all the way through till independence in 1947. And that was a typical example of both the East India Company being broke and its servants being broke. And of course they were all still in their heads. I think they remembered the days of the 18th century when unbridled corruption and getting commissions on everything did produce these great nabobs.
Clive was the richest private citizen in Europe when he came back from looting Murshidabad. But
Yes.
very few made that amount of money. And the salaries were deliberately pitched low. So they were expected to, in the 18th century, they were expected to augment their salaries by private trade.
Yes.
But even that often went badly. I had an ancestor in the Black Hole called Stair Dalrymple, and he had put his entire savings into a saltpeter consignment that went down under the sea. And so he, in the run-up to 1756, he found himself completely bankrupt. He thought he went into the speculation because he couldn't pay his debts. And he borrowed a whole lot of money he didn't have, and the thing went down, and he was totally destroyed. So, in a sense, the arrival of Siraj ud-Dowlah would have been quite a nice opportunity for him had he survived
yes,
it. But,
yes. I mean, the idea that the Imperial Imperative was a sort of unstoppable thing which just went straight on from the beginning to the end, there were always people saying, there were people on the left saying you must not subjugate and exploit these peoples. There were people on the right who said you won't succeed in exploiting them, the sums are not going to add up. There was always a strong conservative arguments against empire, which people like William Pitt and so on very much felt. But and indeed, there was an act passed saying we don't want any more territory. That was in 1784. I mean, long before all the period we're talking about today. So there were always these hesitations and doubts, and it was only the sort of feisty proconsuls on the spot, like Wellesley and Ellenborough and Dalhousie, who were determined that wider yet and wider shall thy bounds be set, and that the empire would go on and on expanding.
Wellesley is the great forgotten creator of so much of British India.
But it's quite interesting how much Dalhousie was ostracized post 1857, and particularly on his return to Britain, and which would lead to the conclusion that a lot of contemporary opinion at that time thought that the uprising of 1857 was directly attributable to Dalhousie's excesses. Now, I'm taking off from there, and I'll ask Willie this question. You've written on 1857, particularly in Delhi, the last Mughal, and here we've got, in Ferdinand's book, we've got pen portraits of Nana Sahib, we've got an account of the last days of Baji Rao, the court of Baji Rao, etc. We've also got a sense of what the Awadh problem, how it stemmed. And how do these various accounts square? Do they actually add up to a definitive pattern? Or is there, after reading, so far as after reading these different accounts, what comes across is that there is a uniform impulse in one sense, which is the loss of sovereignty was certainly an important facet.
I think under Dalhousie there was a very clear policy of trying to expand whenever you could, and the what was it called, the law he passed whereby illegitimate heirs were, or
lapse.
The
doctrine of lapse.
The doctrine of lapse was a new innovation that he brought in, and you do get with first Dalhousie, then with Wellesley, a very determined attempt to absorb territory, which is not, I mean, emphatically, the British arrive in Bengal not to conquer Bengal. It is the Anglo-French rivalry, and then Suraj Dowlah is part of that, and that is a defensive action. But Dalhousie and Wellesley are very aggressive, very imperialist, and Wellesley in particular goes out to make sure, first of all, try and get rid of the French, takes out Raymond in Hyderabad, takes out Tipu because he's getting support from Napoleon, and then he takes on the Marathas. And he's quite clear he wants to use the East India Company. Again, we always remember this is the East India Company still. It's not the British government. It's this extraordinary bit of history where a corporation is eating up a continent and has this very strange relationship with the British state. So, in the same way that the Americans will topple Mossadegh in Persia to get it to stop the Anglo-Persian oil getting nationalized, or will intervene in Allende's Chile and have a coup there in order to protect ITT and other American interests. So the British government is constantly spending government money to strengthen the corporation, so at the end of it, for example, the 7-Year War, I think they spent something like, the British government spent something like 1.5 million, which in that period was you could make it 10 billion today. And yet at the end of the day, the new territories won by state arms went to the company. And the reason for that was that 39% of MPs in Parliament had company shares and stood to gain personally from this. So there's this sort of very modern nexus between corporates and the state. And it's a very, and reading, for example, at the last election here, the role in the corporate houses in backing the new government, putting money at the disposal so that all the adverts and so on. This is very much the sort of thing which was going on in this dance between state power and corporate power with the company.
Absolutely true, and it's very, I mean, some of the most interesting stuff about India goes on in the British House of Commons, where the MPs who are the company, either directly representatives of the company or own large wadges of company shares, are constantly challenged by people who don't have those shares and who think our taxpayers' money is going to support this extremely dodgy and rather brutal private company, and we have no control over it because it's all thousands of miles away. And this argument goes on and on and on, right up until finally the mutiny sort of puts the kibosh on the company. It had already lost its monopoly, but that was the end of it. And
the state beats the corporation at that point.
And the state becomes the corporation, but the state has to undergo huge extra expenditure in order to control it. It becomes now a military state, India, that the ratio of troops, which was 1 British soldier to 9 Indians, now becomes something more like 1 to 2. So a huge number of British troops have to be brought in, which again is a terrible expense. And so you get the bean counters, the accountants, men like Badger, the economist, who are beginning to say, is there, just at the very time when, there are great durbars and wonderful celebrations and there's a huge propaganda effort to make the newly enfranchised British voters think the empire is wonderful. At the same time, there are these hard-headed accountants who are doing the sums and saying it's not going to work. In the long run, we cannot sustain it.
The other very extraordinary moment vis-a-vis state and company power is in 1774, the Regulating Act. And what happens at that point is that the British have, post-1765, they get the Diwani. Clive bullies Shah Alam into making the company the tax collector. It's like the privatization, just like you have G4S taking over prisons in America and Britain. So the company becomes the tax collector for the Mughal in official terms in 1765. And they loot the country so thoroughly and so irresponsibly, combined with a terrible famine in 1770, that the company goes bust. And it doesn't just go bust, it goes bust to the most extraordinary extent. And at this point, 50% of London's docklands are owned by the company and run by the company. 3/4 of British exports are through the company. And it is, in a very real sense, what Lehman Brothers wasn't. It is too big to fail. And the British government has, the banks begin to fall over, first in Scotland, then in France, and about 15 banks go down because the company's shares have crashed. And it is the direct parallel to what happened in 2008 or 2009.
Absolutely the same.
And they have to then they have to spend £2 million of state money bailing out the company, and in return, they get the right to regulate it. So just like NatWest suddenly became a state-owned bank because it had gone so terrifically and had the government overseeing it, so the East India Company in 1774 gets the government initially overseeing it, and the final bit is 1857.
Adam Smith, the greatest Scot who ever lived, was fully aware of exactly how these 2008 crashes happened, and he said it's like, this is the 1774 crash, which of course again the Lowe family went bust in. It's like a man drawing a whole lot of water from a well, and then his neighbour's well, the neighbour has to draw it from the next well, and so it goes on and on in the end, and in the end you all run dry. And it's a wonderful passage describing the effects of this, derivatives and all that, the chain of borrowing which leads to disaster.
You know, this sense of the empire being formed as a sort of unintended collateral consequence is likely to draw a lot of flack, especially from people who believe that there was always a method behind empire, if not a sinister...
The Imperial Project.
The Imperial Project, if not a sinister design, that it wasn't really a fit of absent-mindedness in which empire was created. Now, when a man with a name called Ferdinand Mount, with a pedigree dating back to Theo Metcalfe, the butcher, or really the man who orchestrated the retribution in 1858, writes a book like that, there are going to be a lot of people out there who say, there is an underlying sinister design, an apologia for this. And I'm sure Mr. Dalrymple is very familiar because he's been accused of this a long time. How do you react to this sort of criticism, which is going to come up, and says, who wants to read the history of your family? What's the relevance of it in today's India? And who gave you the authority to pronounce it? And these are questions, rude as they seem, which often get asked. I'm not asking them, I'm just pretending.
No, I mean, we none of us have any authority to pronounce. All we can do is dig up the equivalent of the artifacts of the past and lay them out for the reader's inspection. And the reader can always detect a sinister pattern in the way you've laid them out, so that you're trying to prove something. But if asked that, all I can defend myself by saying is that most of what I discovered, or large parts of it, came to me as a complete surprise, and by no means by no means a welcome surprise either. So that, I mean, far from proving a point, I was startled by the points I'd made. But that doesn't necessarily prove that they're valid, but it proves that there's no great underlying conspiracy.
I think also to be very careful. I mean, there's no question that a figure like Dalhousie and a figure like Wellesley there's no absence of mind at all. It was a considered policy to annex. But you can say there's a more complicated series of causations in the 18th century.
Yes.
But by the time, by the 1830s, the company is an aggressive military machine. It's moved since the 1760s, from when it had about 2,000 troops to 200,000 troops, and it's double the size of the British Army.
It's the largest army,
armed corporation,
and it's up to no good. And I don't think anyone could. And the Imperial project does gather weight and momentum, and sometimes you just find the British government almost sort of bleating when it's the latest actions of the so-called honourable company are reported back to it. They're at that distance with a 4-month sea journey, most of the time you're just looking at fait accompli, which you have little power, even if you wish, to reverse.
I was literally this week in the National Archives getting out Clive's letters to the directors, talking about Plassey, and they're sitting there in the National Archives. Very nice handwriting, very easily read. And what I'd forgotten was that, of course, he had no authority to fight Plassey or conquer Chandanagar. These were all decisions he made aggressively, without even the authority of Fort St. George, without even Madras behind him. Yeah. And in this letter, where he's just conquered Bengal and shipped, incidentally, 100 boatloads of gold from Murshidabad into Fort William, and it's just a straightforward transfer of cash, and straightforward money going from one vault to another, accompanied by a whole flotilla of Admiral Watson's warships. He's actually explaining to these guys, none of them have no idea what's been going on, that he's fought his own war, that he's declared war on his own behalf, that he's conquered Bengal, and he's engaged a corporation in a major land grab of a quarter of the Mughal Empire. But and it's an extraordinary letter. It's sitting there. You open it up, there it is. There it says, directors, you may be a little surprised to know.
Well, which is why he said he was surprised by his own sense of moderation.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
same tone.
Yes.
Same tone.
Yes,
well, I think what it really demonstrates is that to view the history of the British Empire in India from 1757 as a straight line narrative is extremely simplistic, if not flawed. And I think in both cases, Ferdinand Mount's book, through the characters involved, shows the ups and downs, the conflicts in decision making, and the diversity of experiences which marked these people in the East India Company. Now, I'm sure there are lots of people who may want to ask questions or clarifications or
my question to Mr. Mount is, sir, recently one of our distinguished MP, Mr. Shashi Tharoor, went to UK and gave an eloquent speech explaining the atrocities of British Empire and demanded an apology. Do you think Britain owes an apology to India? Do you think Britain owes an apology to India for its misdeed during the Raj?
Well, you could say that books such as this are, if not deliberately written in that way, they present a sort of apology. But of course, there's always something I think a little suspect about offering an apology for events which are completely beyond your control. That is easy to do. The difficulty is to apologize for things for which you are directly responsible, and that's devilish difficult to extract apologies. But I mean, it's a perfectly reasonable thing to ask.
If I could just chip in there, I think what Britain needs to do first and foremost is to know this history. Yeah. You may be surprised to know that it does not appear on any British curricula. No one in Britain is taught this stuff anymore. So most people in Britain have no idea either the good or the bad. They're totally ignorant of it. And like everyone, they assume that their ancestors were basically good guys. Everyone likes to believe their ancestors did good things. And they just don't know it. They don't know the atrocities which took place. They don't know any of this history at all. And so I just thought the most useful thing, in a sense, is not to apologize for something you can't change or haven't no control over, but to be aware of it, to teach it, and to make sure that people learn the lessons of history, and that this sort of thing is not, it never happens again. I think also, I think, yeah, I mean, it seems to me there's a great deal to be said for someone like Tony Blair apologizing for screwing up Iraq. I think there's much less point in his successor Cameron apologizing for Clive, which anyway was not a, you know, not even the British government. It's a marauding corporation like Union Carbide.
Well, it's an interesting point. Enoch Powell used to always say that the empire disintegrated effortlessly, partly because there was no awareness of the empire at home. I don't know how far that's correct, but it's certainly a very interesting point.
Well,
Yeah, actually, this is kind of leading on from what you've just said, Mr. Dalrymple, that in the British school system, the empire just figures as a very vague thing that yes, Britain did have an empire, but the details of it and how it was actually built up is simply wiped out. I mean, it's completely erased. And to what extent do you think the teaching of history matters, or is it just about, you know, okay, something happened, apologize for it in a vague way and go on, right? I mean, you've had demands for Britain apologize for Jallianwala Bagh and this and that and the other, and those can just go on and on, because with an imperial history as long as yours, I mean, there's no end to the kind of apologies you'd be asked to make.
This is the point.
No,
right?
seriously, whether it's Africa or Latin America or Asia, but the point is that the teaching of history, whether it's in England or in India or in Africa, I mean, what kind of difference do you think that would make?
This is the point that I suddenly become a Scot and say that I was colonised too. So, I think it's a huge issue that the British do not know what they did. We're all taught the Second World War and the Holocaust, and we're taught that, you know, racism is something that only the Germans did, and mass murder of people with a different skin colour or religion is a German problem. We literally are not taught any of this stuff. Which is why, incidentally, why books like Ferdy's sell in such large numbers, is that people don't know it and want to know it. There's a huge appetite. This was a #1 bestseller in Britain. And there is a huge appetite to know this stuff. And I should make it clear that Ferdy in no way whitewashes anything. The atrocities are there in this book on show very clearly. What is the relevance of teaching history? I think it's very relevant. I think that you can't deal with the present properly unless you know how you got to the present. In the famous words of Burke, he who does not learn history is destined always to repeat it. And things like the company are an incredibly modern story. The story of corporate excess, the story of a corporation buying a legislature, about corporate money controlling government actions. This is very current.
Very
and current here as much as it is in America or Britain.
The worst thing that the British government did in education was about 20 years ago, when the first national curriculum was brought in, and history was not one of the basic must-do essentials in that curriculum. And this, I mean, I've heard it's very similar in India, that the official emphasis is all on science and technology and technical skills which help you to cope with the world, which are in the most practical way, which are all very important. But without history, you're only half educated. There's no way of dodging that. It's absolutely essential. And history has now crept back into the curriculum, but as Willie says, so far it's the Holocaust, Second World War, and Tudors and Stuarts. 6 Wives of Henry VIII, everyone knows about that. British Empire, nobody knows at all.
Well, I think we have a similar problem here, not so much of history, but of what passes off as history, and often how it's taught, and a great exercise in trying to make it as dreary as possible so as to put off entire generations.